Welcome, everyone, to Safety Stories. I'm your host, Dr. Sharita Green. In these episodes, we will dig into real stories related to workplace safety experienced throughout history, gain understanding of the history, politics, key players, as well as some of the outcomes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Safety Stories. I'm your host, Dr. Sharita Green. In these episodes, we will dig into real stories related to workplace safety experienced throughout history, gain understanding of the history, politics, key players, as well as some of the outcomes, while diving into lived stories that impacted everyday people. Our hope is to present historical information in an unbiased way that leaves you inspired to dig deeper and learn more about our shared history. Welcome to our second episode. We all know the price of chicken. It's printed clearly on the supermarket shelf. It's featured in weekly specials. It's measured in dollars and cents. But what if that price tag is missing something? What if behind every crispy bite, every family dinner, there's another cost? One not paid at the register, but paid in sweat, in silence, in the lives of workers no one saw until it was too late. Hamlet, North Carolina, was once a booming railroad town, fell on hard times by the 1980s. As railway jobs vanished, desperate residents turned to whatever employment they could find, even in the unsafe factories like Imperial Food. Economic desperation. The town became a magnet for low wage industries, especially those seeking cheap labor and minimal oversight. Imperial Food Products moved into a former ice cream plant in 1980, drawn by North Carolina's lax regulatory environment and low operating costs. By 1990, Imperial was one of Hamlet's largest private employers, despite its poor safety record and history of violations. I just want to share one statistic with you as you digest this story. In 1991, the year of the fire, there was only one federal inspector that covered 4,600 work sites. That's a haunting ratio that underscores just how far protections had been eroded. Inside the factory walls, Imperial was run by Emmett Rowe, who had a track record of violations and came south seeking leniency. His plant operated without fire alarms, sprinklers, or inspections, and many doors were padlocked shut. Workers knew the risks but feared losing their livelihoods. Unions organizing? No, not at Imperial. That was not an option. The Hamlet Fire, the seven failures that lit the match. September 3rd, 1991, Hamlet, North Carolina, a quiet town turned into the epicenter of one of the worst industrial disasters in the state. In minutes, 25 lives were lost, 54 more were injured, families were shattered, and futures were erased. This wasn't an accident. It was a cascade of neglect, a collapse of every system that was supposed to protect workers. Let's unpack those seven fatal failures that made this fire not only tragic, but inevitable. Here are the seven key causes that contributed to the disaster. Number one, there was the faulty hydraulic line repair. Inside the plant, a ruptured hydraulic hose sprayed flammable fluid onto open flames near a gas-fired cooker. The repair? It was done with improvised parts, no shutdown, no safety protocols, no significant stop works, just risks. Completely ignored everything. Number two, locked exit doors. To prevent theft, because keep in mind, Emmett Rowe was very concerned about the theft of chickens, the doors were padlocked, which sealed workers inside as the fire raged. Victims were found piled near blocked exits, some trying desperately to kick the doors down. If you look at some of these pictures, you will see handprints, you will see footprints, which validate some of the statements that some of the survivors made in some of their interviews. They talked about banging at the doors, they talked about screaming, they talked about praying. They literally felt as though they were in hell during this experience. Number 3, no safety inspections. In the entire 11 years of operation, the plant was never inspected by North Carolina OSHA. Why? It wasn't registered with the Department of Labor. This was them evading oversight, but this was part of their business plan. This was one of the things that the owner considered when he moved to North Carolina. The leniency. Number 4, no fire alarms or sprinklers. No alarms, no sprinklers. A previous fire had broken the system, and they didn't think or care to repair it. Keep in mind, this was a building that was filled with fryers and gas lines. However, there was no formal defense against flames. The building lacked basic fire protection systems. As I understand it, I think in the building they only had one fire extinguisher. One extinguisher for an entire building. Number 5, no emergency planning, no evacuation plan, no drills. One extinguisher, again, for the entire building. Workers panicked. They were untrained. They were unprepared because management did not plan nor seemingly care for their survival. One of the workers that was interviewed in another documentary, she talked about, wanting to go through fire drills, and she complained, but all of her complaints, all of her concerns seemed to fall on deaf ears. Number 6, hazardous building layout. An open floor plan gave smoke and heat free reign. Sealed rooms trapped toxic air, and refrigerated areas became deadly chambers of suffocation. You had blocked and locked exits. Multiple exit doors were padlocked, which trapped the workers inside. When they did begin to get into the building, they found victims that were piled near the locked doors where they had been, trying to get out, but they were unable to break through. The walk-in freezer. There were 12 bodies that were discovered inside a large walk-in freezer where workers fled, hoping to escape smoke and flames. Tragically, the doors were left open, allowing toxic smoke to enter. Victims died from smoke inhalation or hypothermia. 5 people inside the freezer survived. This is a chilling testament when you think about it to how close the line was between life and death. Keep in mind, in a fire of that magnitude, it's dark, it's black. People don't know direction, they are disoriented, and they're dealing with the toxic fumes. Other locations, some workers escaped through the front entrance, which was unlocked. Other workers were found near the loading dock, where a dumpster and a delivery truck had blocked access until emergency crews moved them. A few workers broke down doors or kicked through walls to escape. When you look at the diagram in sites, you will see the plant had an open layout which allows smoke and heat to travel unimpeded. Plastic strip curtains and sealed refrigeration doors created dead-end zones where smoke pooled and visibility vanished. The lack of smoke barriers or fire zones meant that once the fire started, it engulfed the facility. In fact, it engulfed the facility in under 2 minutes. The placement of bodies told a heartbreaking story of panic, blocked escape routes, and a building designed for production, not protection. 7, regulatory neglect and deregulation culture. The owner, he had fled Pennsylvania after safety violations and intentionally chose Hamlet for its leniency. Local officials, they turned a blind eye to keep jobs in town. Nationally, OSHA, we talked about it, was underfunded with 1 worker for every 4,600 work sites. The plant owner, he had a history of safety violations and moved his operations because of this. Again, The Hamlet chicken processing plant fire of 1991 was one of the deadliest industrial disasters in North Carolina history, killing 25 workers and injuring 54. The tragedy was not caused by one single failure, but again, it was a cascade of systematic issues. Initial reports focused on the horror: black smoke pouring from the Imperial Food Products plant, emergency crews pulling out victims. Local news stations were first on the scene, relying on eyewitness accounts and footage of the devastation. But as national networks picked up the story, the coverage began to evolve. Print outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post ran features not just on the fire itself, but the conditions that led to it. Investigative journalists uncovered troubling details: locked exits, lack of inspections, and years of regulatory neglect. The tone shifted from sympathy to scrutiny. Coverage of Hamlet became a symbol of forgotten labor, rural, low-wage workers invisible in the broader economy. News organizations used the tragedy to spotlight systemic safety failures and the human cost of corporate oversight. Television programs aired extended segments. 60 Minutes and other outlets asked hard questions. Why hadn't OSHA inspected the plant in a decade? Why were the workers trapped behind the padlocked doors? Public reaction was swift, and media played a key role in amplifying voices calling for reform. We didn't just lose lives, we lost trust. The news gave people a reason to care, to demand change, to listen to the families who were silenced for years. The Hamlet fire may have started in an industrial kitchen, but the flames reached the living rooms across the country through the television screens and headlines. News coverage shaped the legacy, turning local grief into national accountability. I just want to share one statistic with you as you digest this story. In 1991, the year of the fire, there was only one federal inspector that covered 4,600 work sites. That's a haunting ratio that underscores just how far protections had been eroded. In the days following the fire, Governor Martin pledged to support victims and families. But beyond sympathy, he did something crucial. He acknowledged the truth. This tragedy was rooted in systemic failure, oversight ignored, inspections evaded, safety sacrificed. Governor Martin didn't wait for the storm to pass. He ordered funding for 24 new factory inspectors. This nearly doubled the state's ability to monitor workplace hazards. He called for a dedicated fire safety division and introduced a worker safety hotline, which empowered employees to report dangers anonymously. Fueled by public outrage and federal pressure, the North Carolina General Assembly, with Martin's guidance, passed 14 new worker safety laws. I'm going to take the time to kind of summarize those 14 laws for you. The first area was worker protection and accountability. Whistleblower protections for employees who report unsafe working conditions, increased penalties for safety violations, including higher fines, mandatory reporting of workplace injuries and hazards, fire safety and inspections, the creation of a new fire safety division within the state government, regular inspections of businesses every 1 to 3 years, depending on risk level, improved fire code enforcement, including requirements for unlocked exits and evacuation plans. Now, as it relates to training and oversight, safety training programs required for employees in high-risk industry, expanded authority for inspectors, including surprise inspections, hiring of those 24 factory inspectors to increase oversight. As it relates to the area of communication and transparency, the establishment of the Worker Safety Hotline for anonymous complaints, public access to inspection records and safety violations, clear signage and emergency instructions mandated in the workplace. A state, once defined by benign neglect, had taken a firm step towards accountability. Governor Martin's actions didn't erase the tragedy, but they marked a turning point, proof that change was possible. Critics said it came too late. Advocates say it came just in time to save others. Either way, it proved this: leadership after crisis can still shape the future. At the time of the fire, President George H.W. Bush was focused on foreign policy and the unraveling of the Soviet Union. Domestically, his administration was pushing for welfare reform, encouraging states to experiment with new models that emphasized work over dependency. In 1992, State of the Union address, Bush called for a shift in the welfare policy. Replace assumptions of welfare state and help reform the welfare system. He promoted state waivers to allow local government to test new welfare models, including work requirements, time limits, and incentives for self-sufficiency. Keep in mind, up until that point, we had been operating under the welfare policies that were established under the New Deal administration. There was a disconnect in a lot of President Bush's efforts. Despite the Hamlet fire's national coverage, President Bush did not publicly address the tragedy directly. His administration focused remained on welfare to work programs, not workplace safety enforcement. Ironically, many of the victims in Hamlet were low-income single mothers. The very population Bush's welfare reforms would later impact the most. Bush's welfare agenda emphasized personal responsibility, state flexibility, and reducing dependency. But the Hamlet fire exposed a deeper truth. The pushing people into work without ensuring safe working conditions can be deadly. The Hamlet fire became a symbol of what happens when economic desperation meets regulatory neglect. And while President Bush's welfare reforms reshaped public assistance, they left unanswered a critical question: what good is work if it costs you your life? President Bill Clinton, he came into office about 1 year later. He launched his campaign. His campaign focus was a promise to end welfare as we know it. His message, that work, not dependency, should define America's safety net. In 1996, President Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, a sweeping overhaul of the welfare system. It replaced aid to families with dependent children with temporary assistance for needy families, also known as TANF. The new law imposed work requirements, time limits, and gave states broad control over how aid was distributed. Clinton called it a way to restore dignity through work, but critics warned it would leave vulnerable families like those in Hamlet with fewer protections and fewer options. Despite national coverage, President Clinton did not publicly address the Hamlet fire directly. The tragedy was largely handled at the state level, with Governor James Martin leading the reforms in North Carolina. Clinton's focus was on the federal welfare policy, not workplace safety enforcement. This reflected a disconnect, the irony. Many of the workers who died in Hamlet were single mothers, high school dropouts, and low-income residents. The very people Clinton's welfare reform would later affect most. The fire exposed how economic desperation forced people into unsafe jobs. Welfare reform, while promoting work, did little to ensure the work was safe. Clinton's welfare reform was hailed as a bipartisan success. Welfare rolls dropped, employment rose, but the Hamlet fire remained a haunting reminder that work without protection is not empowerment, it is exploitation. Now, in the days that followed this fire in Hamlet, Jesse Jackson came on the scene. In the days that followed, one voice rose above the silence. It was Reverend Jesse Jackson, civil rights leader, former presidential candidate, and moral conscience. He arrived in Hamlet not just to mourn, but to speak truth to power. Jackson's moral outcry. Standing before the burned out shell of the plant, Jackson declared, never again must workers be trapped behind the locked doors. These people would have not been killed if the law had been upheld. He framed the fire not as an incident, but as a moral failure, a betrayal of working class dignity and government responsibility. Jackson, he went beyond the call. He visited hospitals, he prayed with survivors, and met with grieving families. He called for unionization, class solidarity, and a shift from racial battlegrounds to economic common ground. He reminded Hamlet and the nation that the fire had no respect for race, gender, or religion. It consumed everyone equally. Jackson and the 1992 Democratic National Convention, which occurred months later, he invoked the Hamlet fire in his speech. He used the tragedy to highlight the need for stronger labor protections, government accountability, and a just economy. Jackson took a stance on welfare reform, while President Clinton, who followed suit behind Bush and pushed for welfare reform that emphasized work requirements and time limits, Jackson warned against punishing the poor for being poor. He argued that corporate welfare far outweighed aid to family, and the true reform must include fair wages, safe jobs, and dignity for all workers. Reverend Jesse Jackson didn't just respond to the Hamlet fire. He used it as an opportunity to reframe it. He reframed it as a symbol of systemic neglect. Let's discuss a few key figures in this fire. There's Emmett Rowe. He was the founder and owner of Imperial Food Products. He had a history of sidestepping safety regulations. He had his previous violations in Pennsylvania. He decided to come down south and, he believed in locking the doors and, he ran his operation very risky. We'll say that. Then there was Brad Rowe. Brad Rowe was Emmett's son, and he was the plant operations manager. He oversaw daily operations. When the fire broke out, he was involved in the improvising of the hydraulic repairs and missing safety features were traced back to his management. He wasn't indicted. Charges were dropped as a part of a plea deal. Then there was James Hare, the plant manager. He managed the floor where the workers panicked and died. As with Brad, legal consequences slipped away through plea arrangements, leaving behind questions about responsibility. Emergency response on the ground. There was David Fuller, Hamlet's fire chief. He arrived on the scene as a small town responder was prepared for. The plant had no fire suppression system, and the layout created a maze of smoke and death. Fuller led rescue efforts and later advocated for better emergency planning, though the town's prior neglect couldn't be undone. This is why it's really important for organizations to have at least an annual meeting with their EMS or their emergency response, including fire department as well as emergency responders, particularly if you utilize chemicals or you participate in work that can be highly hazardous, because when they are required to respond, it gives them an opportunity to bring what's needed to provide the best and most aggressive aid. Investigators and enforcers, There was Gerard Scannell, administrator of OSHA. He flew in to lead the federal investigation. Shocked by the facility's lack of registration and safety, he helped launch a worker safety hotline and called for improved emergency policies nationwide. There was Charles Dunn, deputy director of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigations. He confirmed the fire's cause, a ruptured hydraulic line near a gas-fired cooker. He confirmed it was repaired unsafely, never reported, and fatally ignored. Then there was Charles Jeffress, the Assistant Labor Commissioner for North Carolina. He delivered the chilling truth. The plant had operated for 11 years without a single state safety inspection. The system had failed, not just the regulations, but the lives that they were meant to protect. This wasn't just a story about flames, it was a story of names. Those who let corners be cut, who turned away or acted too late. And in every name, there is a lesson. Emmett Rowe. Let's take a moment to understand what he was concerned about and why those doors were locked. He had a fear of employee pilferage because management at that particular time believed workers were stealing food products. And let me remind you all, the food products, of course, were chicken, control over movement. The locked doors were also used to restrict access and monitor employee behavior. Neglect of safety standards. Rowe prioritized operational control and cost cutting over compliance with fire codes and worker safety. The legal consequences for Rowe. Now, Rowe agreed or participated in a plea deal. That plea deal took away responsibility for his son as well as the other manager. And in this plea deal, he was convicted of 25 counts of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 19 years and 11 months in prison. However, he only served 4 before being paroled. Let's discuss the prior safety violations. Imperial operated a plant in Moosic, Pennsylvania during the 1980s. That facility was cited for multiple safety violations, including blocked or poorly marked exits, emergency exits, improvised equipment repairs, lack of fire safety protocols. These violations prompted fines from OSHA. Now, I think it's important to highlight some of us may have worked in places where we've seen these improvised equipment repairs, or we've seen these situations where there are no formal protocols in place where you stop work and you address not only the issue that's being corrected, but the possible safety concerns in doing that correction. You may have even worked in facilities, particularly in some maintenance departments, where employees feel the need to do their own engineering or do their own creative repair work instead of, either sending the equipment to the manufacturer or calling in a manufacturer approved repair person to do the repair. Now, as it relates to the blocked and poorly marked emergency exits, this again highlights why it's so important to take these tours of your facility, take these walkthroughs, make sure that you have marked appropriately and properly your emergency exits. Also, making sure you're doing annual fire drills. So you don't want to be the only person that knows how to get out of your facility. You want to make sure the most senior employee is aware just as well as your new employees. So it's critically important. And at some point, your life could depend on understanding how to properly evacuate. We've talked about this accident in great detail, but now I would like to take the time to explore it from a different angle, an angle that considers the psychology of those that were involved in the accident. What makes a person operate unsafely? These are just a few things I'd like for you to consider. I think there's evidence there was that there was a misunderstanding of Southern culture. Brad Rowe, who was the son of Emmett Rowe, he was the operations manager. He was only 29 years old. Emmett Rowe, who was the owner, he was about 65 years old. Most of the victims were between the ages of early 20s to around mid 60s. Emmett Rowe was born around 1926, which places him in the silent generation. Most of those born around that time share similar cultural and historical experiences. Some of those would be growing up during the Great Depression and coming of age during World War II. Rowe's business practices and management style were described by prosecutors as dictatorial, which may reflect some of the generational norms around authority and control that were common in mid 20th century industrial leadership. Brad Rowe, the son, he was 29 years old in 1991, and this placed him firmly and squarely in the area of being a Generation Xer. And just to kind of break that down into a little more detail as it relates to understanding the generations, the silent generation, their work ethics and values, they valued loyalty to employers. Many stayed with the company for decades. Respect for authority, hierarchies were accepted and rarely challenged. Hard work equals success. Long hours and perseverance were seen as the path to advancement. Conformity and discipline. They valued rules, structure, and traditional roles. Face-to-face communication, preferred personal interactions over technology. Their work style was that of top-down management. They trusted leadership and followed directives. Job stability. They prioritized security and pension over passion and flexibility. Minimal job hopping. Career changes were rare and often discouraged. Now, shifting to understanding the Generation Xers. Those are persons born between 1965 to 1980. Their work ethic and values, they valued independence and self-reliance. They grew up kind of the quote latchkey kids, often fending for themselves. They have a natural skepticism of institutions, less trust in corporations and government. Work life balance is important. They value flexibility and personal time over climbing the corporate ladder. Pragmaticism, they focused on results, not just effort. Tech adaptability, comfortable with both analog and digital tools. Their work style, they believe in flat hierarchies. They prefer collaborative environments over rigid structures. They have an entrepreneurial spirit. Many started businesses or embrace freelance work. They like job mobility. They're willing to switch jobs for better opportunities or personal growth. Now, when you think about these two generations and you think about the impact OSHA had on these two generations that are trying to work together at that time. For the silent generation, they view things more as duty and deference. They came of age before OSHA was established in 1970. Many worked in industries with minimal regulations where safety was often seen as a personal responsibility. They tended to respect authority and comply with the rules once they were in place, but some viewed OSHA as government overreach at first. Their work culture emphasized loyalty to employers, which sometimes meant tolerating unsafe conditions without complaint. Generation X. They were described as kind of having skepticism and self-reliance. They entered the workforce in the 1980s to 1990s when OSHA was already established. So keep in mind, they are the first generation to work under the protections of OSHA. They grew up witnessing corporate downsizing and economic instability, which bred a more skeptical view of institutions. They valued independence, so they were more likely to question whether OSHA regulations were effective or enforced fairly. Some Generation X workers embraced OSHA protections, but others saw it as bureaucratic red tape that didn't always, reflect real world risks. There are cultural tensions and not really rejections. The tension wasn't outright rejection, it was more about how each generation interprets OSHA or OSHA's role. Silent generation workers often internalized risks and didn't expect external protection. Generation X were more likely to demand accountability, especially when safety failures affected their peers. Northern business mentality versus Southern social norms. Rowe came from Pennsylvania, where his previous plan had union activity and regulatory scrutiny. In Hamlet, he sought the low cost labor, the minimal oversight, and a workforce he believed would be more compliant, especially targeting single women in a high unemployment area. This approach reflected a top-down cost-cutting mindset that clashed with Southern values around community, dignity, and personal relationships. The locked doors created a sense of distrust. This action suggested a lack of trust in his workers and a failure to understand the deep communal ties and expectations of respect in Southern labor culture. In Southern towns, especially rural ones like Hamlet, employers are often seen as part of the community, and Rowe's actions alienated him from that role. Then, cultural blind spots. Historian Bryant Simon argues that Rowe's management style reflected a cheap food, cheap labor, cheap lives philosophy. He just didn't fully grasp the racial and spatial divisions in Hamlet. The plant was located in a predominantly black neighborhood, and its continued presence after the fire became a source of trauma. His failure to engage with local norms and values contributed to a fractured post-fire community where survivors felt abandoned and unheard. In short, Rowe's misunderstanding of Southern culture wasn't just about etiquette. It was about failing to see his workers as neighbors, not just laborers. The demographics of the victims. 18 of the 25 victims were women. Many were single mothers, 56 were injured. 12 of the deceased were African American. The plant was located in a predominantly black neighborhood of Hamlet. The workforce was largely composed of undereducated and impoverished individuals, including high school dropouts. If I were to compare Hamlet of 1991 to something that maybe many of you can kind of identify with, I would kind of compare Hamlet at that time to, I don't know if any of you remember the show In the Heat of the Night. And when they talk about going to the bottoms, Hamlet at that time, I would say was similar to kind of like the bottoms, Let's talk a little bit about what was left for those that survived. Those that survived, they may have physically survived the fire, but they were left with severe PTSD, anxiety, depression, survivor's guilt. Some of their mental illnesses were to the extreme in which they had to find themselves hospitalized. Some went through short-term hospitalizations, some went through long-term hospitalizations. The families of the deceased faced deep emotional trauma. And it was even documented and reported that some of the first responders and EMS workers were psychologically traumatized. Keep in mind, this town, Hamlet, North Carolina, was a small town. It was a tight-knit town. Some of the people in the facility were related to each other. Some of the first responders were related to those that they were rescuing. And if they weren't related to them, many of them went to church with these individuals. So imagine you're showing up to respond to a catastrophe that you have no expectation of even experiencing. And then when you respond, you're pulling out bodies of people that you know. And it's not someone you know in passing, but someone you may know intimately. The people in this town were so greatly affected by this experience that they demolished the building. So After I guess they did the investigation and some time passed, people were so traumatized as they walked past the building that they decided to knock the building down and make a monument area. And I think annually or ever so often they come together and they do a memorial and an acknowledgement of those that passed away. As I've mentioned before, a lot of the employees that worked at this plant were single mothers. And I don't think a lot of people realize, we've given the statistics of how many were injured, how many died, as well as, how many were African American. We've spoken about the general sentiment that a lot of them were under educated. But I don't think anyone has thought about the fact that due to this one incident, 49 children were made orphans that day. Can you imagine? They only had 81 people working in the facility. You had 81 that were working, 25 that died, and then you have 49 children that were left to be made orphans. In reviewing everything that's been available to me, as well as, you know, shared in the news, I think I figured it out. The real cost of chicken. The real cost of chicken was loss of money, a loss of mental health. It was a fire. It was loss of freedom for the owner, a loss of a parent for those 49 children, loss of life for those 18 that died, a loss of corporate reputation within the community. The loss was immeasurable. And when you really think about the real cost of chicken, it turns out it was just absolutely priceless. Some of the survivors of the Hamlet chicken processing plant fire became powerful voices for change, sharing their stories to raise awareness about workplace safety and labor rights. Abby Covington, who was the mayor of Hamlet at the time of the 1991 fire, later became a city council member and played a significant role in memorializing the tragedy and supporting survivors. While she wasn't a survivor herself, Covington's leadership evolved over time. Initially, some of the survivors expressed frustration with her response during the immediate aftermath, but decades later, at the 30th anniversary memorial, survivor Annette Zimmerman publicly thanked Covington for her growth and efforts, saying, "I see you as a different woman now, as I am, and I am grateful for the effort you put forth." Covington's continued presence at memorial events and her reflections on the fire's impact suggests she became a community advocate for remembrance and healing, helping ensure the tragedy wasn't forgotten and that the voices of survivors were honored. Annette Zimmerman, one of the survivors, has spoken publicly about her experience, being trampled while escaping, undergoing multiple surgeries, and living with the trauma decades later. Her reflections have helped keep the memory of the tragedy alive and underscore the need for continued vigilance. Survivors participated in memorial events, they've given interviews and supported efforts to improve fire codes and inspection protocols in North Carolina. Their stories were featured in books, documentaries, and news retrospectives, often highlighting the emotional and physical toll of the fire and the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. While not all survivors became formal activists or advocates, many became accidental advocates, using their lived experience to demand change and ensure that the tragedy would not be forgotten. Let's talk now about corporate social responsibility. Imperial Food Products could have been a far better corporate neighbor in Hamlet, North Carolina, by embracing corporate social responsibility and prioritizing the well-being of its workers and community. Here are a few examples as to what they could have done and how they could have done it. Number one, they could have prioritized worker safety, comply with OSHA regulations, and register the facility for regular inspections, install fire alarms, sprinklers, and unlocked emergency exits. They could have conducted routine safety drills and provided protective equipment and training. Number two, they could have invested in employee well-being, offered fair wages and health benefits and paid leave, created a safe space for feedback, including anonymous reporting systems. They could have created or supported unionization efforts or employee representation to give workers a voice. Now, I understand a lot of companies don't support unions, but they could have created a safety team that it could have been empowered and respected within the facility. So employees would have had a resource there where they could have presented issues, concerns, and seen that team advocate on their behalf. That way, employees would feel not only are they bringing forth problems, but they're actively involved in the solution. Number three, they could have engaged with the local community. They could have partnered with local schools and nonprofits to support education and job training. They could have sponsored community events, health fairs, and food drives. They could have addressed environmental concerns like water contamination with transparency and action. They could have, number four, adopted a sustainable practice. Now, I realize at the time in which they came into the community, it was the early 1980s. But if we were to apply it to today, they could have reduced waste and pollution from food processing. They could have sourced poultry and supplies from ethical and local farmers. They could have used eco-friendly packaging and energy-efficient equipment. Number five, they could have led with transparency and accountability. They could have published annual safety and sustainability reports. They could have invited third-party audits and shared results publicly. They could have responded swiftly and responsibly to complaints or incidents. They also could have encouraged near-miss reporting. Just to review some of the quick facts, the employer that we've talked about was Imperial Foods. The number of people impacted, we had 81 people working, 25 were killed, 54 were injured, and then we had 49, I believe, children that were made orphans. This event took place on September 3rd, 1991 in Hamlet, North Carolina. It was a fire. The contributing factors were improper equipment repair, locked and blocked exits, lack of safety inspections, no fire alarm or sprinklers, inadequate emergency planning, structural and layout hazards, regulatory and economic neglect. Now, many of you listening to this story may say to yourself, oh, wow, that was a long time ago. You know, we have improved since then. We have more rules in place. We have more inspections in place. All of that may be good and great and true. However, I challenge you all to think about, with these improvements, how often are you all really doing fire drills? How often are you really doing these audits? How often are you creating environments where your employees can advocate or feel empowered or feel as though they can stop work? How often are we letting things slip by when we notice maintenance potentially are doing repairs that are questionable? How often are we seeing work situations where there's an upset condition, but there are not proper or appropriate safety measures in place? Are you, as a safety professional, the only person with a focus and an interest of safety at your workplace? Or have you created advocates within others where they can keep an eye out for safety at times when you're not available to see what's going on? Safety is not a one-man or a one-woman show. It's a team experience. As a safety professional, it is your job to, yes, work and create policies, procedures, and programs and lay the foundation. But creating a positive safety culture involves engagement, it involves teamwork, it involves partnership, It involves making sure everyone feels as though their contribution is significant. I wanted to take the time to share with you all some additional resources. Um, there's never enough time to share every single detail, but maybe this story has sparked a curiosity in you where you want to take the time to learn or read more. I would like to suggest to you a book, The Hamlet Fire, A Tragic Story of Cheap Food, Cheap Government, and Cheap Lives by Bryant Simon, as well as A Southern Tragedy in Crimson and Yellow. It's another book. And the most touching documentary, I think it's available on YouTube. You can look at it. It is called Hamlet Out of the Ashes, 1994 by Robert Cotter. And then you can also follow on YouTube Mark D. Catlin. He has a lot of interesting resources that feature a lot of workplace incidents and, safety investigations. So you might want to check out his YouTube channel. In closing, I would like to leave you all with these thoughts. The Imperial Chicken Processing Fire wasn't just a local tragedy, it was a national indictment. It revealed what happens when regulations are ignored, when profit outweighs protection, and when workers become invisible until it's too late. We must remember that those padlocked doors weren't just a violation. They were a symbol of corporate greed that saw chicken nuggets as more valuable than human life. And we must hold accountable the systems meant to protect. OSHA, underfunded and overextended, with one inspector for every thousands of workers, local officials who practice benign neglect in the name of job preservation, and a culture that taught workers to stay quiet, even as alarms failed, sprinklers rusted, and exits disappeared. But let this be clear. The people of Hamlet didn't die in vain. Their names live on as a call to conscience, a reminder that every workplace has a heartbeat, and every safety story should start with dignity and end in justice. In memory of those lost, we vow to keep telling the stories that corporations wish we'd forget until safety isn't a privilege but a promise.